A lonesome cry pierces the dusty silence of a Colorado road in 1884, stopping Ezekiel Boone, a weathered widower and former soldier, in his tracks. Haunted by loss, he's a man hardened by the frontier's cruelty, yet the sight of a trembling girl sparks something long buried within him. What begins as a cautious encounter unravels into a tale of survival, trust, and redemption that will bind two broken souls. Will Ezekiel's choice to protect her defy the dangers lurking in the shadows? Discover a story that redefines family in the harshest of lands. Subscribe now. Share where you're listening from, and stay tuned. Will courage triumph over fear? Don't miss the heart of this journey. The sun hung like a vengeful god over the Colorado plains in 1884, scorching the earth into a cracked, red scar that stretched toward the horizon. Ezekiel Boone, a widower etched by grief and war, gripped the reins of his creaking wagon, his eyes squinting beneath a battered hat. Dust swirled around the wheels, coating his calloused hands, and the sweat-soaked shirt clinging to his broad frame. His mule, Rusty, plodded with stubborn resolve, hooves kicking up clouds that stung the air like whispered curses. Ezekiel, once a soldier who'd seen rivers run red in the west, now hauled supplies to his lonesome ranch, a speck of defiance against the untamed frontier. The road to Bitter Creek was a gauntlet of ruts and regret, flanked by brittle sagebrush that clawed at the wind. Ezekiel's thoughts drifted to the daughter he'd buried 5 years prior, her fevered face a ghost that never left. The silence was heavy, broken only by the groan of wood and the rhythmic thud of Rusty's steps. Then a sound sliced through, a child's sob, raw and jagged, like a blade against stone. Ezekiel's hand instinctively grazed the revolver at his hip. Bandits roamed these parts, cunning enough to use a child as bait. He urged Rusty forward, jaw tight, ready to pass by. But the sobs grew sharper, pulling at something deep in his chest. Against his better judgment, he slowed the wagon. There, huddled by the roadside, was a girl, no more than 8, her small frame curled like a wilted flower. Her dress, torn and caked with dirt, hung loose on her bony shoulders. Her face was buried in her knees, but the trembling of her body told a story of loss too heavy for one so young. Ezekiel's heart, scarred and guarded, stirred with a flicker of the man he'd been before death stole his family. He eased Rusty to a stop, the wagon's creak falling silent. "Easy, now," he muttered, more to himself than the mule. Climbing down, his boots crunched against the parched earth, each step deliberate. The girl's sobs faltered as she sensed his approach, her head lifting to reveal eyes wide with fear and sorrow, streaked with dust and tears. Ezekiel crouched a safe distance away, his voice low, rough as gravel but softened by caution. "Little one, where's your kin?" Her lips quivered, struggling to form words. Clara Mae," she whispered, voice barely louder than the wind. "My mama, Papa, they're gone." Fresh tears carved muddy trails down her cheeks. "Bandits came. Mama pushed me into the bushes. Papa fought, but..." Her voice broke, swallowed by a sob that seemed to shake the earth itself. Ezekiel's gut twisted. He'd seen death's work too often, comrades in battle, his wife, his daughter. But this child's grief cut deeper, a mirror to his own buried pain. He scanned the horizon, hand still near his revolver. The plain stretched empty, but danger lingered like a coyote's shadow. "How long you been out here, Clara?" he asked, his tone steady but urgent. "Since yesterday," she said, wiping her nose with a trembling hand. "I hid, then walked. Didn't know where to go." Her hollow cheeks and sunken eyes spoke of hunger and exhaustion, a child left to the mercy of a land that spared no one. Ezekiel stood, his shadow falling over her like a shield. The smart move was to ride on, leave her for the sheriff in Bitter Creek. A lone man taking in a strange child invited trouble. Bandits, gossip, or worse. But as Clara's eyes met his, pleading without words, he saw his daughter's face, felt the ache of failing her. He couldn't turn away. "Come on, girl," he said, offering a weathered hand. "We'll see to your folks first. They deserve a proper rest." Clara hesitated, then slipped her small hand into his, her grip weak but trusting. Ezekiel lifted her onto the wagon, her weight barely more than a sack of grain. She clutched a torn shawl, her only tether to the life she'd lost. He clicked his tongue, and Rusty plodded toward the direction Clara pointed, a faint smudge of a wrecked wagon in the distance. The air grew thick with the sweet, sickening stench of death as they neared. Ezekiel's jaw clenched. He knew what he'd find. The Morrison wagon lay tilted, one wheel shattered, canvas flapping like a wounded bird. Nearby, two figures sprawled in the dirt. A woman, her face pale and still, and a man, his hand outstretched, as if reaching for her even in death. Clara's sob broke the silence, and Ezekiel squeezed her shoulder. "Stay with Rusty," he said, voice firm. "I'll handle this." He grabbed a shovel from the wagon, its handle worn smooth by years of hard use, and set to work under the relentless sun. The ground was unforgiving, each spadeful a battle against rock and clay. Sweat stung his eyes as he dug 2 graves, the labor a grim ritual he'd performed too often. Clara watched from the wagon, her small form hunched, clutching her shawl. Ezekiel found a broken plank from the wagon and carved their names, John and Mary Morrison, as best he could. He wrapped the bodies in tattered blankets, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since his daughter's funeral. As he covered them with earth, Clara stepped forward, placing a handful of wilted sagebrush on the graves, her lips moving in a silent farewell. Ezekiel stood back, wiping his brow, his eyes catching fresh hoofprints circling the site. The bandits hadn't gone far. He looked at Clara, her face a mix of grief and resolve, and knew taking her to town wasn't an option. Not yet. "Clara," he said, voice low but certain, "you're coming with me. Ain't safe out here." She nodded, climbing back onto the wagon, her small hand gripping the seat, as if anchoring herself to this new, uncertain path. Ezekiel snapped the reins, and Rusty pulled them toward the ranch, the horizon swallowing the graves behind them. The weight of his choice settled in his bones, not just duty, but something fiercer, something that felt like purpose reborn. As the wagon rattled toward Ezekiel Boone's ranch, the horizon swallowed the fresh graves of Clara Mae's parents, their makeshift crosses fading into the Colorado dusk of 1884. The hoofprints circling the wrecked wagon gnawed at Ezekiel's mind. Bandits were close, their greed a shadow trailing the girl beside him. Clara sat silent, her small hands clutching the tattered shawl, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if searching for something the prairie couldn't give. The ranch came into view as the sun bled amber across the plains, a squat cabin and weathered barn standing defiant against the endless scrub. Ezekiel guided Rusty to a stop, the mule snorting as dust settled around them. Clara's gaze darted to the darkening hills, fear flickering in her eyes. "They out there?" she whispered, voice barely louder than the evening breeze. Ezekiel didn't answer right away, his own eyes scanning the ridge for movement. "Not tonight," he said finally, voice low and steady. "But we'll be ready if they come." He helped Clara down, her steps unsteady from exhaustion and grief. The cabin's interior was sparse, wooden walls scarred by time, a cold hearth, a single chair by a table bearing the weight of solitude. Ezekiel lit a lantern, its glow casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of his past. Clara stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if crossing the threshold meant accepting this stranger's world. ain't much," Ezekiel said, tossing a log into the hearth. "But it's dry and it's safe." Clara nodded, clutching her shawl tighter, and stepped inside. Ezekiel set to work, pulling a blanket from a trunk that hadn't been opened since his wife's death. The scent of lavender lingered, a faint echo of a life long gone. He handed it to Clara, who wrapped it around her shoulders, her thin frame swallowed by its folds. "You sleep there," he said, pointing to a cot near the fire. "I'll take the floor." She didn't argue, her eyes heavy with the weight of the day, but sleep didn't come easily. Ezekiel lay awake, the creak of the cabin and Clara's uneven breaths filling the silence. Each sound stirred memories of his daughter, her laughter once alight in this same room, now dark with loss. Dawn broke with a harsh clarity, the sun cutting through the cabin's single window. Ezekiel rose, joints creaking like the floorboards, and found Clara already awake, staring at the embers. "You didn't sleep," he said. Not a question. She shook her head, her voice small. "Kept seeing them. Mama and Papa lying there." Ezekiel's throat tightened. He knew that kind of haunting, the way the dead lingered in the quiet hours. "Ain't your fault," he said, kneeling to stoke the fire. "But we gotta keep moving forward. It's what they'd want." He boiled coffee and fried strips of salt pork, the sizzle a stark contrast to the stillness. Clara ate sparingly, her hands trembling as she held the tin plate. Ezekiel watched her, weighing his choices. The town of Bitter Creek was a day's ride away, where the sheriff or the preacher's wife could take her in. It was the practical thing. Leave her to folks better suited for a child. But the thought of her alone, handed off like a stray, twisted something fierce in his gut. Those hoofprints at the wagon weren't just tracks. They were a warning. The bandits knew Clara had seen them, and men like that didn't leave witnesses. "We're staying here," Ezekiel said abruptly, surprising himself. Clara's eyes widened, a mix of relief and uncertainty. "You mean it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his decision settling like a stone. "But it ain't gonna be easy. Ranch life's hard, and trouble's got a way of finding us." He didn't mention the bandits, but the weight of their threat hung between them. That morning, Ezekiel took Clara to the barn, showing her the chickens and the single milk cow. Her hands, though small, were quick to learn, scattering feed with a focus that belied her grief. Ezekiel watched, noting the way she threw herself into the work, as if keeping busy held her together. "You're a quick study," he said, tossing her a pair of gloves too big for her hands. "Keep those on. Blisters ain't no friend out here." By noon, he was mending a fence, Clara trailing behind, handing him nails from a rusty can. The work was a rhythm, a way to outrun the ghosts in their heads. But as the sun climbed, Ezekiel's eyes kept drifting to the horizon. Those hoofprints haunted him, a promise of violence circling closer. He taught Clara to spot tracks in the dirt, showing her the difference between a deer's delicate print and the deep gouge of a shod horse. "You see these," he said, pointing to a faint mark near the creek. "You run for the cabin and bar the door." That evening, as the sky burned red, Ezekiel cleaned his revolver by lamplight, the metallic clicks sharp in the quiet. Clara sat across from him, mending a tear in her shawl, with a needle from his wife's old sewing kit. "They're coming, ain't they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Ezekiel didn't lie. "Maybe. But we'll be ready." He showed her how to load the rifle, her small hands fumbling but determined. "Ain't about wanting to fight," he said. "It's about being ready to protect what's yours." The night settled heavily, the wind howling like a warning. Ezekiel barred the door, his senses sharp, every creak of the cabin a potential threat. Clara slept fitfully, her murmurs of "Mama" cutting through the dark. Ezekiel stayed awake, his back against the wall, revolver across his lap. He'd taken her in, not just out of pity, but because something in her eyes mirrored his own stubborn will to survive. The bandits might come, but they'd find a man who'd already lost everything once and wouldn't let it happen again. As the stars burned cold above the prairie, Ezekiel knew this choice. Keeping Clara had changed him. It wasn't just about sheltering a child. It was about reclaiming a piece of himself he'd buried with his daughter. The stars burned cold above Ezekiel Boone's ranch, a silent vow that he'd protect Clara Mae from the shadows trailing her. The Colorado night of 1884 wrapped the cabin in an uneasy quiet, broken only by the wind's low howl and the faint creak of Clara's cot as she stirred, whispering for her lost mother. Ezekiel's grip tightened on his revolver, his resolve hardening like the frost on the window pane. Days bled into weeks, and the ranch became a fragile refuge. Clara threw herself into the rhythm of survival, her small hands mastering tasks Ezekiel hadn't expected her to grasp so quickly. She rose with the dawn, scattering grain for the chickens with a precision that belied her 8 years, her thin frame moving with purpose through the morning chill. Ezekiel watched her from the barn, hammering a loose board, his breath clouding in the crisp air. The girl's resilience was a quiet fire, burning through the grief that still woke her screaming some nights. He taught her to milk the cow, her fingers fumbling at first, but soon steady, pulling steady streams into the pail. "You're a natural," he grunted, tossing her a rag to wipe her hands. Clara's shy smile flickered, a spark in the gray dawn. The ranch was no paradise. Fences sagged, the well pump groaned, and the soil fought every seed they planted. Yet Clara attacked each chore with a ferocity that made Ezekiel pause. She'd kneel in the dirt, coaxing life from the vegetable patch his wife had once tended, her hands caked with earth as she hummed a tune he didn't recognize. It was her way of outrunning the ghosts, he reckoned, just as his endless repairs kept his own demons at bay. One afternoon, as they hauled water from the creek, Clara stopped, pointing to a hawk circling above. "Think it's watching us?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. Ezekiel squinted skyward, shielding his eyes. "Maybe. Out here, everything's got its eye on something." He didn't say it was the bandits he watched for, their hoofprints a constant shadow in his mind. By evening, Clara's chatter filled the cabin, her stories of imaginary adventures weaving light into its stark corners. She'd spin tales of lost treasure or brave riders, her words tumbling out as she darned socks with his wife's old needle. Ezekiel, whittling a stick by the fire, found himself chuckling at her tales, the sound foreign to his own ears. "You ought to write these down," he said, half serious. "Folks'd listen." Clara's eyes lit up. "Think so? Maybe one day." Her words hung there, a fragile hope, and Ezekiel felt a pang. Maybe this story of theirs was worth sharing too. "If you're moved by stories like Clara's," he imagined saying to some unseen listener, "join us on this journey. Subscribe to hear more tales of grit and heart from the frontier." He shook off the thought, focusing on the fire's crackle, but the idea lingered, as if their survival deserved an audience. The peace was shattered one moonlit night, the kind where the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Ezekiel was oiling his rifle when a distant thud broke the silence. Hooves, too many and too fast. Clara froze, needle poised mid-stitch, her eyes darting to him. "It's them," she whispered, fear stripping her voice bare. Ezekiel was already moving, barring the door, his voice low and sharp. "Under the table, now." Clara scrambled into the shadows, clutching her shawl as Ezekiel doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. The hoofbeats stopped, replaced by the crunch of boots and low, guttural voices. Ezekiel peered through a crack in the shutter, spotting 4 figures dismounting, their silhouettes sharp against the moon's glow. The leader, a lean man with a scar slashing his cheek, barked orders, his eyes glinting with greed. "Girl saw us," he growled. "She's here, and so's whatever they hid." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. They weren't just after gold. They wanted no witnesses. He gestured for Clara to stay low, his hand steady on the rifle. The first kick splintered the doorframe, wood groaning under the assault. Ezekiel fired a warning shot through the gap, the crack echoing like thunder. "Next one's in your chest," he shouted, voice hard as iron. The bandits laughed, a cruel sound, and a torch flared, casting jagged shadows. Bullets tore through the door, splintering wood, and Ezekiel returned fire, his shots precise but outnumbered. Clara's shallow breaths came from beneath the table, her fear a weight in the air. As a bandit's axe bit into the door, Ezekiel faltered, his ammunition dwindling. Then a crash. Clara, defying his orders, had grabbed the oil lamp and hurled it through the broken shutter. It shattered on the porch, flames erupting in a roar, catching the leader's coat. He screamed, stumbling back, and the others froze, caught off guard. Ezekiel seized the moment, firing 2 quick shots that dropped the nearest man. The others scattered, dragging their leader into the dark, their curses fading with their hoofbeats. Ezekiel pulled Clara from under the table, her face pale but fierce. "You could have died," he growled, but his grip on her shoulders was gentle. "Had to help," she said, voice trembling but unyielding. He nodded, the weight of her courage settling deep. They'd survived, not just by his gun, but by her nerve. As dawn broke, painting the prairie red, Ezekiel knew this fight had forged something unbreakable between them. A bond born in fire and defiance, stronger than the threat still lurking beyond the horizon. Dawn broke over the Colorado prairie, the red light of 1884 spilling across Ezekiel Boone's ranch like a promise kept. The scars of the bandit attack lingered, splintered wood on the porch, bullet holes in the doorframe. But the bond forged between Ezekiel and Clara Mae stood stronger, a quiet defiance against the night's violence. The air carried the sharp bite of autumn, and Ezekiel felt a shift, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath. Clara stood by the fence, her small frame silhouetted against the rising sun, a rake in her hands as she cleared debris from the fight. Ezekiel watched her from the barn, oiling a harness, his thoughts heavy. The bandits were gone, for now, but their kind never stayed away forever. He'd planned to take Clara to Bitter Creek, to the preacher or the sheriff, where a child might find a softer life. Yet the memory of her throwing that lamp, her fierce resolve in the face of death, anchored him. She wasn't just a stray he'd picked up. She was his responsibility, maybe more. He set the harness aside and walked to her, boots crunching on frost-kissed dirt. "You don't gotta do that," he said, nodding at the rake. Clara's eyes, no longer hollow but bright with purpose, met his. "I want to. This is home now, ain't it?" Her words hit like a rifle's recoil, plain but true. Ezekiel's throat tightened. Home hadn't meant anything since his wife and daughter's graves grew cold. He nodded, unable to speak, and handed her a pair of gloves. "Then we do it together." The days hardened into routine, the ranch a battleground against the land's relentless demands. Clara learned fast, her hand steady as she drove stakes into the earth for a new fence, her breath clouding in the chill. Ezekiel taught her to shoot, the old rifle heavy in her grip, but her aim true. "Keep your elbow up," he said, adjusting her stance. "Out here, you gotta be ready for anything." Clara nodded, her jaw set, and fired at a tin can, the ping echoing across the valley. Ezekiel hid a proud grin. She was tougher than the prairie itself. Winter loomed, and they prepared with the urgency of survival. Ezekiel showed Clara how to smoke meat, the air thick with the tang of burning hickory. She hung strips of venison with care, her small fingers deft despite the cold. At night, by the fire's glow, she practiced her letters, scratching words onto a slate while Ezekiel read from a tattered book of Psalms. Her questions came sharp and curious, about the stars, the land, his past as a soldier. He answered sparingly, but each word built a bridge between them, fragile but growing. One evening, as snow dusted the prairie, Clara paused mid-sentence, her pencil hovering. "Ezekiel, you ever think about leaving this place?" Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of her losses. He leaned back, the firelight carving lines on his weathered face. "Thought about it plenty. But this land's all I got left. It's where I fight for what's mine." Clara nodded, understanding more than her years should allow. "I want to fight for it too," she said, and Ezekiel saw his own stubborn grit reflected in her eyes. The first real challenge came when a territorial judge rode out, his horse kicking up dust as he questioned Ezekiel's fitness to raise a girl alone. "Ain't proper," the judge said, peering over his spectacles. "She needs a woman's guidance, schooling." Ezekiel stood firm, his voice steady. "She's got a home here, sir. I'm teaching her what matters, work, grit, how to stand tall." Clara, summoned to speak, stood straight, her voice clear. "I ain't going nowhere else. Ezekiel's my family now." The judge frowned but saw the fire in her eyes, the weight she'd gained under Ezekiel's care. He relented, signing papers that made Clara Mae Boone official. Spring arrived, the prairie bursting with wildflowers that softened its harsh edges. Clara tended the garden, her hands coaxing green from stubborn soil, a mirror of Ezekiel's late wife. One morning, as they stood on the porch, the mountains framing their world, Clara slipped her hand into his. "You think Mama and Papa are proud of me?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. Ezekiel looked at the horizon, the weight of her question settling deep. "I reckon they are, Clara. You're stronger than this land, and they'd see it." She squeezed his hand, her smile a quiet victory. The ranch was no longer just Ezekiel's. It was theirs, built on shared labor and unspoken trust. He'd given her safety, but she'd given him purpose, a reason to face each dawn. As they worked side by side, planting seeds under a sky wide as hope, Ezekiel knew they'd carved a family from the prairie's unyielding heart, a bond no bandit or storm could break. The tale of Ezekiel and Clara Mae weaves a rugged thread of grit and heart, born from the harsh Colorado frontier of 1884. Their bond, forged in loss and defiance, reminds us how hope can rise from the dust. What did their story stir in you? Share your thoughts. Your voice adds to this journey. I'm grateful for you joining us in this tale of survival and family. Until the next story unfolds under the wide prairie sky, keep the fire of courage burning. Farewell for now, and I look forward to meeting you again in the next chapter of the Untamed West.